All right, today we will pick up with our last class on Providence. And this is where a lot of times people will start when talking about Providence, is just looking at biblical examples. So I wanted to do this in reverse. There are so many examples we could look at. We're only going to look at a few, and how many we get through, I'm not sure. So that's why I have Acts 7 and Hebrews 11, because those are condensed ways to go through a good portion of biblical history. And those also chronicle a great deal of where we will see God's providence in operation. So we've been looking at his providence through specific examples of things that actually describe his providence. Sometimes we just jump in and we say, look, through this biblical example, do you see his providence? But we don't really know what providence is. And so that's why we've been trying to look at the various aspects of providence, the from the side of uh, the effect prayer can have on God's providence, his authority being directly related to his providence, his omnipotence being directly related to his providence. All of those things are important to understand. When you understand all of those, then when you look at the various examples we see in history, you can better understand and see his providence at work. So normally we look at these examples and we say, oh, yes, I see God's providence. But we've now looked at a lot of the details of that. And so we know that in all of these, God is exercising his uh, ability to be omnipotent, all powerful, so he can do anything. We know that his omnipresence means he can be anywhere and everywhere. Indeed, he is outside of space and time, so he can occupy all of it in a way that we can't even fathom. And that he is omniscient, that he knows all things, which means the future and the past are nothing to God. Uh, while we would be hard pressed to know the future, it would be impossible for us to know the future with any certainty. With God, this is not a problem. So we encompass all of that. Then we take in man's free will. I still have free will, even though God knows the choices I'm going to make. I have free will to make those choices, and I'm therefore accountable for all of my choices. God knows the choices I'm going to make, and whether they be good or whether they be evil, he can utilize that to bring about his will and a greater good maybe for myself. Even if my choices are evil, he could bring about a greater good. How could that be? How could me making a bad choice be utilized by God to bring about a greater good for me? Yes.
It would probably, well, you learn from making mistakes, and hopefully you get back on track. And God uses our good choices and our bad choices. He knows what we're going to do, so he's already had providence in everything we do.
Yeah. In many things, there are lessons to be learned. Now, we may learn them or we may not, but God puts many lessons in our path. We can look back. If you've lived any length of time, you can look back and see that there have been lessons to be learned. And if we're honest, there have been lessons that we missed that maybe we picked up later on. Do you know what I mean by that? Just something that you say, oh, I really wish I had been mature enough or insightful enough or aware, alert enough to have picked this up back then. But I can see it. I can see it in hindsight. And so all of these things can be utilized as part of God's providence to bring about his greater good and good for us, good for others around us. So We look out and we see and we turn on the news and we observe things. And why does God allow all of these bad things to happen? However, our goal is to get to heaven. And our goal is to help others understand, those who are willing to understand, help them know how to get to heaven as well. That's our goal. Our goal is not about comfort here. It is not about life here. And so the greater good that we ultimately are talking about is the good that would allow us to see God in peace and allow others to see God in peace. Yes.
Well, ultimately, I agree that when you keep in mind our ultimate goal, that our comfort here is not hardly material to that. But at the same time, there's nothing wrong with trying to be comfortable and have a nice house and a family and all that stuff, correct? That's not a bad goal.
It's not a bad goal. It cannot be your primary goal. It cannot. Love God. That's your primary goal. However, these other things are good. Look, while we're here, there is human to human interaction that we should have. So our goals for family, our goals for love, one another, these are important things. If you're chasing after stuff, if you're chasing after money, if you're chasing after a big home, then you're probably in for a rude awakening if that becomes your primary goal. However, as you're going along, if you are able to have a nice home to live in, thank God for that. Thank Him for that. But if it's your primary goal in life, you're probably in for a very rude awakening, because we sing the song, "This world is not my home." So what will I be doing if that is what is most important? Love God, love your fellow man. Why love your fellow man? Why would that? I mean, people are going to perish. Why love your fellow man be so important, more than a house, for example? Yes.
God says, love your neighbor as yourself.
Absolutely. And yes.
We're to emulate God.
Yes.
God loves all these people, and by inference, we should care about them also.
Yes. Both of those answers are absolutely right, because God says so. But when I compare it to a home, the thing that I'm comparing it to is something that is temporary. Each and every soul that you see, not one of them is temporary. Not one of them. We have an everlasting soul. We want to see God in peace, but we have an everlasting soul. And so that's why it doesn't compare to a house. So how we treat our fellow man, we may be caught up in the flesh, but these are souls, these are spirits. These are in the very image of God that we're interacting with. That's far more important than the temporary monies that countries will print, the homes that we may construct that may go up in flames at any moment. Far more important than any of that is how we treat our fellow man. Yes.
And that's probably a big reason that we don't evangelize as much as we could. As humans, we just see them as another human being. And this is a problem person, or that person's this, and there's a homeless person. And we're seeing their earthly representation and not that they're an eternal soul.
Yes. Yeah. Whenever I have a struggle with dealing with some individual on a personal level, a lot of times, just personally, I'm not talking about just clashing personalities. I'm talking about just a struggle treating someone the way I'm supposed to treat them. That's my own failing. And a lot of it is because I'm looking at some other aspect of them and not the fact that this is a soul that needs to be saved. That's a struggle that we have, if we're honest. And so we have to overcome that. So when we look at God's providence, all of this is wrapped up in it. All of these different elements, so much so that we can't fathom it. We can't fathom how it works. But we can understand that it does work because God is able to do all things. So even though we can't figure out how this would be manipulated and all of these things throughout time to bring us to this point in time, God can do all of that. So when we look at Acts chapter 7 and we look at God's providence, and like I said, I selected some things. I've got a few things selected in particular, but a lot of them will be covered in some of these that we're going to look at, just because it covers so much in a very concise way. Acts chapter 7, then the high priest said, are these things so? And he said, men and brethren and fathers, hearken. The God of glory appeared unto our father Abraham when he was in Mesopotamia before he dwelt in Charan, and said unto him, get thee out of thy country and from thy kindred, and come into the land which I will show thee. Then came he out of the land of the Chaldeans and dwelt in Charan, and from thence, when his father was dead, he removed him into this land wherein ye now dwell. So God tells Moses what? Abraham what? Yes.
Trust me, leave your family. He had to trust in God
Yes. How much did he have to trust in God?
a lot.
Where was he going?
To an unknown area for him.
Yes. Now, if I asked you right now, okay, every one of you, I want you to go. What's the first question you would ask? Where? Where do you want me to go? Just go. I'll tell you when you get there. That's what happened here, right? Go. And I'm going to tell you when you get there. And what did Abraham do? He went. That was great faith. But here's the question. Did he get to where he needed to go? Yes.
I think God would have stopped him had he gone east into China instead of west.
Would God have stopped him?
Yeah.
If God wanted him to go in a particular place, because God said, look, you're going to go to a land that I will show you. So it wasn't up to him. So if we want an answer to that question, we'd have to ask Jonah. Right? God said go, and Jonah said, yeah, I'm going that way because I don't want to go where you told me, because I'm going to help you out, God. That was his attitude. You're too forgiving. I'm going to help you out. So I'm going to go the opposite way. And God showed him. So God tells Abraham here, look, you're going to go into a land that I will show you. So that means it's very specific. But he didn't tell him exactly where. He lets him know, look, go. And God guides him. Brother Mary. All right. All right. So God guides him where he needs to go. Again, God's providence right at the start of this story, this biblical history. In verse number 5, and he gave him none inheritance in it, no, not so much as to set foot on, yet he promised that he would give it to him for a possession and to his seed after him, when as yet he had no child. And God spake on this wise, that his seed should sojourn in a strange land, and that they should bring them into bondage and entreat them evil 400 years. And the nation to whom they shall be in bondage will I judge, said God, and after that shall they come forth and serve me in this place. And so he talks about what's going to happen in Egypt. He doesn't have any seed yet, and God tells him what's going to happen. We call this what? When God tells you something that's going to happen that hasn't happened yet, what is that called? Prophecy, right? It's called prophecy. So God's prophecy and his providence, how do we reconcile that? Is it prophecy that this was going to happen, or is it providence? Thank you. It is absolutely both. God knows what's going to happen. But we would be foolish to believe, based upon everything we've seen and what we've been told, God doesn't have a hand in it, a guiding hand in it, right? This is exactly how it was supposed to play out. And we see the details. We read Exodus and we see the details playing out. We read about Joseph and we see the details playing out of all of this. This is God's providence as well as prophecy. So providence and prophecy can be so closely connected that you may not see any difference at all, where one ends and the other begins. See, that would require us to really understand the mechanics of this, and we cannot. We can't. But we know God's in control. We know he knows all things, so he told them before it happened, this is going to happen. And to what elements of all of the things that he manipulated to come about in all of this, we don't know. We don't know every detail, every string which was pulled, every lever which was used to have all of this come about. But we do know God is involved in it. He goes on, or before we go on, let's deal with some of the details. His seed shall sojourn in a strange land. So they go into Egypt. They're going to bring them into bondage. Now, they bring them into bondage. God has predicted this, but in what way would God have a hand in this? Sometimes we compare the slavery and the bondage of this to our history, very different things. God has a hand in this. Was the bondage a good thing? No. How do we know? Yes.
Well, they cried out and God relieved their bondage after hearing their plea.
Yes, and also in the next verse he tells us, and the nation to whom they shall be in bondage will I judge. Did he judge him?
He judges every nation, though, doesn't he?
Yeah.
So,
But specifically here, he tells us how he judged them. How did he judge Egypt?
to their detriment.
To their detriment. What did they have to give to Israel? God gave them plagues to release them. And when they released them, what did Israel leave with? Yes.
Well, they not only left with all their workers, but they took a vast wealth with them.
They took a vast wealth with them. It was the spoils for what they had to give them their due wages after the fact. That was by God's judgment. That's the reality of it. So he says, look, I'm going to judge them. And we look in history and see he did indeed judge them. So why allow them to go into bondage in the first place? What good came out of that? In spite of the fact that he judged the nation for it, in spite of the fact that it was evil, what good came out of it? Yes.
They realized they needed God.
They realized they needed God. Yes.
They become highly skilled workers.
They became highly skilled workers. What else? Yes.
They vastly multiplied.
Multiplied, yes, in spite of the bondage. What we see is them becoming much, much stronger. They were mightier than the Egyptians, right? The Egyptians became softer as they used them as labor. They became stronger. How were the Hebrew wives described? Remember when they were going to kill the babies? Yes.
That they were very strong and didn't wait for the midwives to come and have a baby.
Yes. They were mighty. That's how they were described, as being very, very strong. How did they become so strong? Egypt strengthened them. In treating them bitterly, they became stronger. So again, I'm not trying to say this was a good thing that Egypt did. It is good that was a result. There was a good result that God utilized. So much like when we read Joseph and say, you meant it for evil, God meant it for good. There can be good that comes out of very evil things, very horrible things. What lesson should we take away from that? As Christians, do we not see some horrible things going on in the world? Very disturbing things. If you don't, you have not read a newspaper, read news online, or turned on a news channel in a while, because if you do, you will see there are some very horrific things happening in the world. As a Christian, we should not lose hope. Yes.
We should know that ultimately, one, they're going to be judged by God, but secondly, that God turns these events usually to his purpose and his will.
Indeed. Indeed. Now that can be very difficult for us to take. I mean, if you were able to talk with somebody who went into bondage during this time and was entreated bitterly and asked them, do you want to be utilized in this way? I'd venture to say that they'd probably say no. People don't like to suffer. But we may be called on to suffer for a greater good. What do we think about that? Yes.
Well, we have great examples throughout the New Testament of how the first century and first 3 or 4 centuries of Christians were treated, how the apostles, how Jesus was treated, and yet it was all God's will. And we're here because of it, so we should be conscious of the fact that if God gives it to us, one, he doesn't give us more than we can handle, but there's usually a reason.
Indeed. And we have to hold on to these things. We also have to be very, very mindful and reminded and constantly look at them. The reason is these are actually harder concepts than we'd like to admit. You know, as Christians, we like to speak the rhetoric. But deep down, if we're honest, some of these things are very, very hard. I was going to ask this as a question, but I'll just make it as a statement. If I were in the situation of the man born blind in John chapter 9, and the ultimate statement is that, look, this wasn't because of any sin or any reason, any other reason other than for the glory of God. I'd have some mixed feelings about that. God, isn't there another way you could have demonstrated than to have me suffer my entire life for this? I'm not saying a hypothetical. I'm telling you, this is a mixed feeling that I can tell you I would have, because I'm going to be honest with you. Sure, the right thing to say as a Christian is no problem. Anything that brings about the glory of God. That's the right answer as a Christian. But let me just be honest with you. That's a difficult thing. Whenever I read that passage, it is a difficult thing to put myself in that man's place.
It's difficult to, we complain about some very small things, and we make a big deal of these small trials in our life when we compare them to some huge trials. The blessing is, if we have an eternal soul, this is such a small blip that it won't matter in the long run. That's what we have to keep in mind.
Yes, how do we keep that in mind?
Stay in God's will.
We've got to stay there because we're going to forget. And this is why I'm bringing it up. And I hope it's okay, because I know sometimes people want a minister to act like they have it all together. You guys have known me for over 20 years. I want to share what struggles I have with you. I want to share the successes as well as the failures. So we all know we're working on this and how. I know the answer. I know the right answer. But that doesn't mean that every moment of the day, that's the way I'm thinking. Therefore, just like Brother Tharp said, I've got to stay in the Word. I've got to have that struggle. I have to go and reread some of these stories and remember the purpose and the points that God would have us to know. And I imagine will be an everlasting struggle for me. I don't want to come across as if I have it all together and then go home and have to deal with the reality. I want us to all understand. For me, it's a struggle. And it's a struggle that's only can be overcome by staying in God's word. So I know the answer to that. But like I said, I read that story and it's not just an automatic. I have some complicated feelings about that. When I read this story about this nation going into bondage, isn't there another way God could have strengthened them? When you watch Rocky 3, there's this training montage. Couldn't that be used to strengthen Israel? Just a little quick montage of clips, and then they're all mighty. And no, they went into bondage 400 years. They were in that land. They were entreated very, very bitterly. Terrible, terrible. How do I know it's terrible? Because God tells me it's terrible by his judgment, and still he allowed it to happen. Not only did he allow it to happen, he allowed it for his greater good. How do I reconcile it? Just as Brother Tharp had pointed out, this is but a short time. The things we will suffer, and what we read about is a lot of people suffering many, many things. Brother Tharp.
And that's one of the things that I've always struggled with is the timeline that God does things. If I was born in the second or third 100 years there, I wouldn't see the outcome. And God's timeline is such greater than our short lives that we might suffer our whole life and not even see what the benefit will eventually be. We have to trust God.
Except we will see what the benefit will eventually be. And I mean, again, these are the things we deal with as human beings. We feel like, yes, we wouldn't see it. And then we remember spiritually, well, we will see the outcome. If we trust God, if we lived according to how he would have us to live during that time, Christ's blood was for them as well. He lets us know that, even for them that were afar off. At the end of Hebrews 11, which we're definitely not going to get to tonight, he lets us know that even for them, Christ died. So again, these are the feelings that I want us to see when we start dealing with God's providence. Sometimes it's not so easy to look at and to take a deep look into it. We can have some complicated feelings, and it's okay for us to have complicated feelings. We are feeling individuals, human beings. God made us that way. This is not a question of denying what we feel naturally, but rather overcoming the natural man with the spirit. He goes on. He says he gave him the covenant of circumcision, and so Abraham begat Isaac and circumcised him the 8th day, and Isaac begat Jacob, and Jacob begat the 12 patriarchs. And the patriarchs, moved with envy, sold Joseph into Egypt, but God was with him and delivered him out of all of his afflictions and gave him favor and wisdom in the sight of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, and he made him governor over Egypt and all his house. So here, the Bible specifically says, if you go and read that story of Joseph and you see everything that's going on, it's clear where God is moving. But here you get it encapsulated. And verse 9, it says, patriarchs moved with envy, sold Joseph into Egypt, but God was with him. So this is not just prophecy. This is God actually moving to preserve Jacob or Joseph, to make him, deliver him into the place that he needs to be. And so where he would ultimately serve someone who had great favor, and for someone else to later come along who didn't even know of them. All of this was part of God's plan. But each of these individuals that moved evilly against God had free will. They had a choice. Yes.
It's, you'd have to be blind not to see God's providence, because you look at Joseph, you look at Moses, you look at Daniel, all these people from outside nation come up to be the second in power to the leaders of these nations. The chances of that happening once are fantastic. 3 times to God's people that we know of, and you just see God's hand in all through their lives.
Indeed. It's, again, when we read this sort of history and we try to apply all of these principles of providence that we've been talking about, and the prayer involved and the interaction of God, we can see it all. And prayerfully, it helps us to accept it all as true, but in an honest way, in a way that really says, look, they trusted God. God is active. He is interacting in all of these things, whether they see it or not. You know, a burning bush is something you see, right? But there's a whole lot going on here that we don't see. We're about to see the dearth come along the land. Where was God's hand in that? Is that something you directly see or indirectly? You know, we see famines come and go. Is God behind each and every one of them? I don't think we can say that. There's a natural cycle. However, if God doesn't want something to happen, it won't happen. It doesn't mean he wants people to suffer. It means that if he doesn't want it to happen, it will not happen. So there are things that he allows. There are things that he's actively involved in, and you and I will never know all of the details of that. How do we feel about that? The fact that we don't know. Yes.
Yeah, sometimes we do know.
Sometimes.
I mean, I look at my life and I look at my job. I went into computers, and that field started to go away, and I had to go work with my brother construction, and then that went away and everything. And yet it put me in a perfect place to help us do this building. And you wonder, were those all random, or was my whole life leading up to the point I'm at now? And that's just one thing. There's so many times things happen and you just say, now that you're starting to look at how God's providence works, how often does he even work in my life?
And for me, from a, you know, if you kind of take a scientific approach to analyzing that, I have similar stories, and I feel like that's God's providence. But can I say 100% this detail is God's providence? I can't prove that. Now I believe it. If you ask me what I believe, this is what I believe, but I can't prove it. And for me, I have a hard time with that. Because before I became a Christian, I was a cosmologist. I wanted the answers. I wanted to research the answers. The patterns had to be there. The math had to work out. Look, answers are there. I want the answers. So I come to believe the Bible. But there's a part of me that still wants the answers.
One day.
I'll have to accept. I have to accept not knowing. But again, that's the humanity side. I'm just trying to be honest with you. I still want to know. It bothers me not knowing. That's how I'm made. Now, what do I have to do? I have to always overcome, that the fleshly side of me, and accept that God has given me everything I need to know for truth and life. That's it. The idea that there's answers in the math out there, in all of the physics out there, I have to let go of that. Because look, I cannot reconcile that with the fact that God is spirit. There's no way there's going to be answers to that out there, because that's outside of this physical universe that we occupy, that God has created. So it's impossible. So I have to let go of that, but still, it bothers me. That's my reality. Constant struggle, flesh against spirit. Isn't that the common struggle we all have? It may show itself in different ways, but don't we all have to battle against the flesh? Yes.
And, I'm right there with you. I can't prove any of these things. I've come to believe them. And isn't that where the world laughs at us when we try to say this is God's providence, and they just say, oh, it's just chance. And they laugh at us for believing that God is active in our lives.
And that's okay, because it is laughable if you don't understand. Our job is to try to help people understand, those that will, those that are interested in understanding. We can't force it on anyone. So if someone's interested, we teach them. And that's all we can do. We need to be thick-skinned as Christians. That's a reality. If people laugh at Christianity, they're laughing at God, and we need to help them. Did someone else have a comment? Yes.
You mentioned about Joseph. I think that his life gave us a very good lesson in that there will be evil around us, and we will be tested, and yet we have the God, we're just blessing of being a free moral agent to decide. And eventually, all those bad things that happened to him from his very own brothers, in the same family, and then he became victorious, and yet he harbored no ill will. I mean, that is the standard I think he has set for us
Indeed.
to live.
Indeed. And again, if we're going to get there, we have to work at it. We have to struggle with it, because we're going to constantly have to battle Satan. We're going to constantly have to battle the flesh. Temptations that are out there. Doesn't mean we have to fail to them, but we'd be much wiser acknowledging that they exist than pretending to be something that we're not. Pretending that this is not a problem. All right, enough of Joseph. There was a whole section on Joseph we didn't even talk about. Paul's conversion, how is that a demonstration of God's providence? What was he doing? Yeah, he's killing Christians, persecuting Christians, right? And what happened? How? How did he become a believer? Did he just wake up one day and decide he believed?
Sort of, with a little help.
With a little help from
God.
Providence. We see a direct example of God's providence. We see God directly involved. Like I said, the parts that we have to try to pull together is sometimes we see directly, sometimes we don't. We see the bigger picture. Is anyone familiar with chaos theory at all? Have you ever heard of that? Okay. All right, no, it's irrelevant. We won't even talk about it. Uh, there's a lot of things going on. There's a lot of things pulling in a particular direction sometimes, and God brings them all about. We don't necessarily see God's hand directly in it. But if you're walking along a roadside and you're blinded and you hear a voice and it says, hey, go and talk, and he's going to tell you what you ought to do, you're hard pressed to deny that God is involved. And we know here God was directly involved. Why? Why would God do this with him and not with the rest of the world? There's a whole world out there that's lost. Blind them and tell them to go talk to those over there on Disneyland Drive, and they'll tell you what you ought to do. Could God do this?
Yes.
He did it once. He could do it again, right? He could do it to everybody out there. Why not? Yes.
Because he had a plan, and that plan's been executed, and this is how he wants people to be saved. So although he doesn't do overt miracles, like blinding Paul on the road, that we know of, he works in Providence. And I'm going to go back just for a second. What you were saying is, when you started mentioning chaos theory, I won't get into that, but the idea is a little thing happening can have a big consequence. We've all watched science fiction movies where somebody goes back in time and steps on an ant or kicks a rock and they disappear. Some small change can have huge consequences. And that's how I always pictured God's providence. He wants an outcome. He just goes farther enough back and he just has to make a little change that's not huge. He sees the effect immediately, so he can control anything he wants through the smallest action.
Absolutely. God is in complete control over all of these things.
Right.
And why wouldn't he blind everyone? You know, the real answer to that question that I would give, I have no idea. Because God has a purpose that we ultimately don't know. If you dig deep enough, and this is one of the areas I know a lot of Christians don't want to delve into. But again, let's just be honest. It's just you and I and YouTube out there. Let's just be honest about it. Why is God doing things the way he's doing it? Why does he let some be saved and most be lost? And what's his ultimate goal? What's his ultimate purpose? Why go about this way? Because, again, let me speak foolishly. If I were God, I would just make everybody perfect. Why not?
I can tell you why.
Yes.
I think God wants willing believers, willing worshipers, not ones he just manufactures. He could make those all day long. I often thought that's what the angels were, but obviously we see even them do wrong, so they have some free will. He wants us to come to him. He doesn't want us to, he won't make us where we automatically hear his service. That's not what he wants. He wants us to have that love that he has and to do it willingly.
Now, that was eloquently said, but it didn't answer my question. Two things. You said, I think, as a very first thing. So it didn't answer the question. And second, you said, God doesn't want this. He wants this. And we can see that through what's going on. I'm not disputing that. But the question is why? I wouldn't want a bunch of unruly people. I'd want the automatons that are going to do what I want them to do.
That's why we don't want you to be God.
Is that the only reason? Is that the only one? I think that's only part of the reason. But there's a limit to the things we know. We can give all sorts of excuses and reasons. And I absolutely agree with you. That's how far I will take it. We can see that much. God has revealed that much to us. But why? If we're honest, we have no idea. Yes.
Well, one of the things that comes to my mind is we have something today that they didn't have 2,000 years ago. We have the written word. And we can see why God did some of the things that he did back then. Now we have Christ. And he wants us to look to Christ and to read the teachings of the apostles who were guided by the Holy Spirit. These are things that we have that they didn't have back then. So,
Well, they had the Old Testament,
yes, they did.
but they didn't have the New Testament revelation of that. But even in the Old Testament, they were told a great deal about the reasons that these things, for example, Abraham was told exactly what was going to happen in the future. Now, they had to come back in the New Testament and say, yeah, this is why it all happened. And see, God told you way back here. So they missed it. And so we see in the New Testament, a great portion of it is revelation, but we have the completed word. This is our final testament. This is our final dispensation. And so we have truth and grace. So indeed, they didn't have access to that. They didn't have access to forgiveness before Christ, without Christ. So absolutely. But when we deal with some of these things, we do have to take it truly on faith. We do have to take it without knowing the answer. And for some people, that's easy. It comes very easily, and that's fine. For me, it comes very, very difficult. It's a very, very difficult thing to accept. Okay, I can ask why, but I'm not going to get necessarily an answer until maybe one day. And I only say maybe because I don't know if I'll still have the question then. If I get to a time where there's no more death, no more pain, no more tears, I don't know that I'd really, these questions, having that yearning to get an answer, that can be looked at as a sort of pain. If pain is gone, then maybe that question is gone from me. Maybe I just don't care anymore about that. So true, maybe the answers will be revealed. Maybe I'll still have questions and I'll be able to get answers, or maybe I simply won't care anymore. Yes.
How many times a day when you're on the computer that you've been asked this question, are you a robot?
Every time someone wants me to pass a security check.
Have you ever passed?
All the time, because I am a robot, and robots are smart enough to learn from these things these days because of programmers. So anyway.
Why did they ask you that question? They want to know whether you're a robot. Why did they ask you that question?
Yeah, that has nothing to do with any of the rest of this, but rather people behaving in manners that are deceptive and the like. So it goes to the core of it. And if God had made everybody perfect, then you wouldn't have people behaving in deceptive fashions, and there'd be no need to ask people, are they a robot?
Would be passwords.
So among us, we do not want to deal with robots. So with God, definitely he doesn't want to deal with robots.
I do. I'd rather deal with robots. You all get on my nerves. No, I'm just no. We're at the close of this class. If we had gone through everything, we would have talked about not only Paul's conversion, the storm. We see God continuing to act with Paul through the storm. I'm just going to go through this because I don't think there's a reason to keep going on. I think we see this throughout history, but I just want to mention it so you can maybe take a look at this at your own leisure. His persecutions are mentioned in 2 Corinthians 11, and we know God with all the things that Paul suffers. I'm doing something that I never did go through his. Okay. Well, this was to talk about Joseph. This is Paul, his conversion, the storms that I was just talking about, the persecutions that he talks about, the things that he suffers, we know God had to be with him, because most people wouldn't live through that. Look at Rahab. You can see God's providence in that story. Ruth and Naomi, my goodness, you can see the hand of God throughout that story. Abraham and Isaac, obviously. So and obviously Moses and the Exodus. Just read the stories and contemplate all of the elements of God's providence, not just the concept, the big picture, but the elements of God's providence. I believe it's a worthwhile exercise for us as Christians to just remember how awesome God is. With that, I will close.
Number 74. Abide with me. Do me, abide with me. Fast falls the eventide. The darkness deepest. Lord, with me abide. When other helpers fail and comforts flee, help of the helpless, oh, abide with me. Swift to its close, ebbs out life's little day. Her joys grow dim, its glories pass away. Changed and decay, in all around I see. O thou who changest not, abide with me. I need thy presence every passing hour. What but thy grace can foil the tempter's power? Who like thyself my guide and stay can be? Through clouds and sunshine, oh, abide with me. Number 47. God is so good. God is so good. God is so good. God is so good. He's so good to me. Jesus is real. Jesus is real. Jesus is real. He's so real to me. He saved my soul. He saved my soul. He saved my soul, and he made me whole. I praise his name. I praise his name. I praise his name. He's so good to me. We'll have Michael lead us in a closing word of prayer.